Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
What happens when Hollywood's most commanding voice walks onto a daytime talk show known for its fiery debates? You get a confrontation no one expected, and one that left the studio audience on edge. Samuel L. Jackson, the man whose booming presence has defined generations of films, joined The View expecting to talk about his latest project, but the conversation quickly veered into dangerous territory when Joy Behar, never one to hold back, posed a loaded question. Is America softer than it used to be? At first, it was playful sparring. Sam joking about people today complaining too much, Joy countering with sarcasm about old-school toughness. But the tone shifted fast. What began as laughs soon turned into sharp words, raised voices, and a battle of philosophies about grit, compassion, and what it really means to survive in America. The audience didn't just watch, they lived every second, gasping, cheering, and whispering as the clash escalated. And when Samuel's patience finally snapped, his voice boomed across the studio, rattling the table and leaving Joy visibly shaken. This wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was one of the most explosive showdowns daytime television had ever seen. The studio lights of The View bathed the set in a golden glow as the crowd clapped in unison. The atmosphere carried the familiar daytime energy, cheerful, expectant, but always with that edge of unpredictability. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whoopi Goldberg announced with a grin, "please welcome the one and only Samuel L. Jackson." The audience roared. Some stood, clapping and whistling, as Samuel strode onto the stage in a sleek gray suit paired with his signature Kangol cap. He gave a casual wave, flashing that wide grin, and leaned into Whoopi for a hug, before shaking hands with Sunny, Sarah, Anna, and finally Joy. Thank you," Samuel said, his gravelly voice carrying easily over the applause. "This is the loudest audience I've heard all week." The crowd laughed, clapping even harder. Samuel sat back in his chair, his body language relaxed but commanding, like a man who owned every room he entered without even trying. Whoopi leaned in, setting the tone. "So, Sam, you've had an incredible career, you're still at the top of your game, and you're here to talk about your new project. But since you're with us, we've got a hot topic we'd love to get your thoughts on. Do you think America is tougher or softer than it used to be?" The audience murmured with anticipation. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, you're trying to get me in trouble already. All right, I'll say it. People today? Softer. Way softer. Back in the day, you didn't have Twitter to complain on. You had to deal with your problems face to face. People had grit. Now, the second someone gets offended, they want to call HR, cancel somebody, or sue. That's not toughness. That's fragility dressed up as fairness." The audience reacted with a mix of laughter, applause, and a few surprised gasps. Samuel leaned back, his tone light, almost playful, but the sharpness in his words couldn't be missed. Joy Behar, who had been sitting with a small smile tugging at her lips, perked up. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand like a cat ready to pounce. "So let me get this straight," she said, her voice dripping with irony. "You think people being more sensitive, more aware, more compassionate means they're weak? That sounds a little old man yelling at the clouds, don't you think?" The audience burst into laughter, some clapping at the jab. Samuel tilted his head, his grin fading slightly into something sharper. "Old man yelling at the clouds, huh? Let me tell you something, Joy. Back when I was growing up, you didn't have a choice but to be tough. You wanted to survive, you had to push through. You couldn't sit around talking about your feelings on national TV." Joy raised her eyebrows. "Or maybe, Sam, people were suffering in silence because they had no choice. Maybe what you call toughness was just suppression. Isn't progress about not having to bury everything inside until it breaks you? The audience clapped loudly, cheering Joy's counter. Samuel nodded slowly, clearly enjoying the sparring. Sure, he admitted, there's progress, but we've swung so far the other way that now people crumble over the smallest things. Life is hard, always has been, and pretending we can protect everyone from struggle, that's not compassion, that's delusion. The audience gasped again, divided between cheers and uneasy murmurs. Whoopi jumped in with a chuckle. See what you did, Joy, you got him going. But Joy wasn't backing off. Oh, I'm just warming up. Because what I'm hearing is Samuel L. Jackson thinks compassion is weakness. I think compassion is strength. Maybe America's not softer, maybe it's just wiser. The audience applauded again, the tension sharpening as the two locked eyes. Samuel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his deep voice cutting through the cheers. Well, Joy, I guess we're about to find out. The crowd erupted once more, knowing a clash had just been set in motion. The spark had been struck, and the fire was about to spread. The tension that had been simmering since Samuel's first jab about America being softer now began to ignite into something bigger. The audience sat perched on the edge of their seats, clapping or booing, depending on whose words hit hardest. Joy crossed her arms, leaning back with that wry smile she often used when ready to pounce. Sam, come on. Let's not act like toughness is measured by how much pain you can bottle up. Maybe people today are actually stronger because they can talk about their struggles openly instead of pretending everything's fine while falling apart inside. The audience clapped, a few cheers echoing through the studio. Samuel smirked, shaking his head. Joy, you call that strength? Talking about your problems is one thing, living through them is another. My generation didn't have the luxury of airing grievances on daytime TV. We had to handle our business. We didn't get participation trophies just for showing up. Laughter rippled through the crowd, some applauding loudly, others groaning at the familiar phrase. Joy leaned in, her voice sharpening. That's such a cliché, Sam. Participation trophies? Really? Let's be honest, you're romanticizing the past. People back then weren't tougher, they were just forced to suffer in silence. Women in abusive marriages, veterans with PTSD, kids bullied mercilessly. Nobody called that toughness, they called it survival. And survival isn't the same as thriving. The audience clapped again, some nodding vigorously. Samuel's smile faded, his voice dropping into that unmistakable growl that had carried across movie theaters for decades. Survival is toughness, Joy. You think life hands you a gold medal for thriving? No. Life is about making it through the hard times, not expecting the world to cushion you every step of the way. People today are too quick to say, I'm hurt, I'm offended, I can't handle this. Toughness is learning to handle it, even when it's ugly. The audience gasped, some clapping, others booing. The energy in the room was split down the middle. Joy raised her voice to cut through the noise. Or maybe toughness is admitting when you can't do it alone. Maybe real strength is in community, in compassion, in saying, I need help, instead of breaking down quietly. I'd argue America is stronger today because people don't have to hide in the shadows anymore. That line drew loud applause and a few shouts of yes from the audience. Samuel leaned forward now, his eyes locked on Joy, his voice thundering just enough to rattle the table. Stronger? You think we're stronger now? Then explain why people fall apart at the slightest inconvenience. Why do we have a culture of outrage, where every disagreement is treated like an attack? That's not strength, Joy. That's fragility dressed up as virtue. The studio fell into murmurs, the audience torn. Some clapped at his bluntness, others booed at the critique. Joy, sensing the opening, went for the jugular. You sound like one of those people who say, back in my day. You know what else was back in your day, Sam? Segregation. Women earning half as much as men. Gay people hiding in fear.
If that's the kind of toughness you're glorifying, forgive me, but I'll take today's so-called softness any day." The audience erupted, cheers, gasps, even whistles. It was a bomb of a statement, and the studio shook with the force of it. Samuel froze for a second, his jaw tightening. Then he leaned in slowly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a storm. "Don't twist my words, Joy. I'm not glorifying injustice. I lived through segregation. I fought through it. I know exactly what that world was. What I'm saying is, we fought. We endured. We didn't crumble under pressure. That fight is what gave you the platform to sit here and say what you just said." The audience roared, half standing, the cheers nearly drowning him out. George tried to speak, but Samuel raised his voice, louder now, almost booming. "You call that softness progress? Fine. But don't forget, the progress you celebrate came from the toughness of people who refused to fold when the odds were stacked against them." The applause was deafening, though divided. Joy shot back, her voice cutting through the chaos. "And maybe the lesson from that toughness is that no one should have to endure that much suffering again just to be taken seriously. Maybe we're softer, Sam, because we finally believe people deserve better than endless hardship." That landed hard, the audience clapping and cheering once more, leaving the studio in uproar. Whoopi leaned into her mic with a half smile, half sigh. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we ask the tough questions. But it was clear, this wasn't just questions anymore. The debate had boiled over, emotions riding high, with both Samuel and Joy digging their heels deeper. The audience was split, electricity filled the air, and everyone knew something bigger was about to break.
The back and forth had been fiery, but Samuel's face shifted now. The playful smirk was gone, his eyes sharper, his tone dropping lower. The audience felt the change before he even spoke. "You want to talk about softness, Joy," Samuel said, his voice deliberate, rumbling like distant thunder. "Let me tell you about toughness. I grew up in segregation, Jim Crow. I wasn't reading about it in history books, I was living it. My mother cleaned houses so I could have food on the table. She stretched $1 until it screamed. We didn't have safety nets. We didn't have the luxury of breaking down." The audience grew quiet, the applause gone now, replaced by heavy silence. Joy blinked, caught off guard. Samuel leaned forward, his hand flat on the table. "I watched my mother walk miles to work because buses wouldn't stop in our neighborhood. I watched neighbors denied jobs because of their skin. And I'll never forget being told as a boy, 'Know your place.' You want to talk about toughness? Toughness was my mother smiling at me every night, even when she had blisters on her feet and no food for herself. Toughness was knowing the world didn't want me to succeed and fighting anyway." The audience broke into spontaneous applause, but it was softer, reverent. Some were visibly emotional. Even Whoopi, who had been watching carefully, gave a small nod of respect. Joy leaned in, her voice quieter, almost cautious. "And that is powerful, Sam. No one is taking away from your story. But does that mean everyone should have to endure that kind of suffering just to prove they're strong? Isn't progress about not putting people through what you and your mother went through?" Samuel nodded slowly. "You're right about progress, Joy. Nobody should have to live through that. But here's where we disagree. You call today's sensitivity strength. I call it fragility. Because the second someone hears a word they don't like, they collapse. My mother didn't collapse. My neighbors didn't collapse. They fought. And they kept fighting because they knew the world wasn't going to hand them comfort." The audience applauded again, louder this time, though still mixed. Some clapping for Joy's compassion, others for Samuel's grit. Joy pressed further, emboldened. "But Sam, think about it. If people had spoken up more back then, maybe it wouldn't have taken so long to change. Maybe what you call fragility is actually people refusing to be silent. Isn't that its own kind of toughness, refusing to swallow pain in the name of pride?" Samuel paused, his eyes narrowing. His voice rose, rich and booming now, filling every corner of the studio. Don't confuse speaking up with falling apart, Joy. There's a difference. My generation spoke up. We marched, we protested, we put our lives on the line. That was toughness. Today, people call it toughness when they tweet angrily from their couch. That's not the same fight. The crowd roared, clapping and shouting his name. The sound was thunderous, but the energy was no longer playful. It was raw, electric. Joy, visibly rattled, but unwilling to back down, snapped back. And yet, Sam, aren't those voices online, the ones you mock, part of why change happens faster now? People don't have to march in the streets to be heard. They can make noise from anywhere. Isn't that just evolution? Samuel slammed his fist lightly on the table, not enough to intimidate, but enough to make the mugs rattle. The audience gasped. Evolution? He repeated, his voice a growl. Don't tell me fragility is evolution. Evolution is when people adapt, get stronger, survive the storm. We didn't survive by whining. We survived by fighting. And I will never apologize for saying America has gotten softer when I see people falling apart over words while others are still fighting for their lives. The audience exploded again, some cheering, others booing. The divide was visible, the energy chaotic. Whoopi raised her voice, trying to mediate. Okay, deep breaths, everybody. This is real, this is raw, and clearly it's hitting nerves on all sides. But it was too late. The emotional floodgates had opened. Samuel's story had pulled the entire studio into silence. Then his thunderous rebuke had snapped them back into chaos. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was personal, it was visceral, and it had transformed the stage into a battlefield of philosophies. Toughness versus compassion, survival versus softness. And the room knew something even bigger was about to explode. The tension in the studio was suffocating now. Samuel leaned back slightly, his jaw tight, while Joy crossed her arms, her chin lifted as if daring him to keep pushing. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, some ready to cheer, others ready to boo, but everyone knew the powder keg was about to ignite. Joy struck first. You know what this sounds like, Sam? It sounds like you're saying people should just suffer in silence, that unless they've been through what you've been through, they don't have the right to speak up. That's not toughness, that's gatekeeping. Samuel's eyes snapped back to her, the faintest flash of fire in them. He leaned forward again, his booming voice shaking the table. Gatekeeping? No, Joy, it's called perspective. It's called knowing the difference between real struggle and imagined inconvenience. And I'm tired of people confusing the two. My mother didn't have the luxury of crying on national television because someone hurt her feelings. She had to keep moving or we didn't eat. That's not silence, that's survival. The audience erupted again, half cheering his passion, half booing his bluntness. The noise only seemed to fuel him further. Joy, her face flushed, shot back with a sharper tone. And yet, Sam, you built a career playing men who never stayed silent. You shouted, you fought, you swore, you performed toughness. But now when younger generations speak out, suddenly they're weak? That's hypocrisy. The word hypocrisy landed like a slap. The crowd gasped audibly, and even Whoopi's eyes widened. Samuel didn't flinch. He let the silence hang for a moment, his stare locked on Joy like a laser. Then he slammed his palm flat on the table so hard that the mugs rattled and the audience jolted. You don't get to call me a hypocrite, Joy, he thundered, his voice echoing like a war drum. I earned every word I say. I've lived it. I've bled for it. I've marched for it. Don't you sit there in your comfortable chair and tell me about hypocrisy when you've never walked a mile in those shoes. The studio exploded. Cheers, boos, shouts, all clashing at once. Cameras shook as producers frantically gestured from behind the scenes, trying to calm the chaos. Joy leaned forward, practically shouting now to be heard over the uproar.
You think struggle belongs to you alone, Sam? That nobody else has the right to demand better because they didn't grow up exactly like you? That's arrogance, plain and simple. Samuel's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping low and dangerous. No, Joy, what's arrogance is assuming your panel chair gives you the authority to rewrite the meaning of toughness. What's arrogance is telling people who fought through hell that their sacrifices don't matter because now comfort is the new strength. Joy threw her hands up, exasperated. This isn't about comfort, it's about progress. If people are finally able to demand better lives without having to bleed for it, that's a good thing. Samuel leaned in so close the audience could see the fire burning in his eyes. Then maybe we're not demanding better lives, we're demanding easier ones. And an easier life doesn't always make a stronger person. Sometimes it makes a weaker one. And if you can't see that, Joy, then maybe you've been sitting at this table too long to know what real struggle even looks like. The air went dead still. The jab landed like a thunderclap. The audience gasped again, some in shock, others in wild applause. Joy's face went crimson, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words but couldn't find them fast enough. Whoopi jumped in, raising her voice above the roar. All right, this is a heavy one, folks. We're clearly not going to solve it all in one morning. Let's take a breath, please. But the damage was done. The spark had ignited into a full inferno. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was personal. It was raw. And it had shaken the studio to its core. And as the camera zoomed in on the panel, Samuel's face set like steel, Joy fuming and breathless, the audience knew this clash would be remembered long after the show ended.
The studio had fallen into a strange silence, the kind of silence that doesn't settle but lingers, vibrating in the air like the last echo of a gunshot. Samuel L. Jackson sat back in his chair, still simmering, his gaze focused straight ahead rather than at Joy. Joy Behar, meanwhile, gripped her mug tightly, her jaw clenched, refusing to let her expression betray the heat of the exchange. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the mediator, leaned forward with a weary sigh. All right, folks, we've all just witnessed a conversation that clearly touched a nerve, and maybe that's the point, because whether you agree with Sam or Joy, one thing's for sure, this question isn't going anywhere. The camera cut to the audience, where faces told the story better than words. Some were nodding firmly, their eyes locked on Samuel, as though he had voiced truths they'd been waiting to hear. Others leaned toward Joy, clapping gently in solidarity with her insistence that progress meant easing burdens, not glorifying suffering. Sunny Hostin tried to strike a balance. We should acknowledge something here. Sam's perspective comes from a lifetime of experience, real hardship. And Joy's point is about using that history to build something better where people don't have to endure the same pain. Maybe it's less about who's right and more about how we balance both truths. The audience murmured in agreement, but the electricity of the clash still hovered. Joy, refusing to let the moment define her as the one who lost, leaned into the camera. This is what democracy looks like. People disagree, sometimes passionately, but we don't walk away. We wrestle with the hard stuff. Samuel chuckled darkly, finally turning his head toward her. Yeah, but sometimes wrestling looks a lot like yelling, Joy. The audience laughed nervously, easing the tension just a notch. Whoopi seized the chance to wrap things up. We could go back and forth all day, but the truth is, the bigger question here matters more than who's sitting at this table. So let's leave it with all of you. The camera zoomed out, catching the panel in one wide shot. Whoopi turned to the lens, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. The question is simple, but the answers are not. Is the U.S. healthcare system failing older Americans? The audience erupted into applause, some loud, some hesitant, but all acknowledging the weight of the question. Samuel crossed his arms, his expression still ironclad, while Joy lifted her chin defiantly.
Neither looked fully satisfied, and maybe that was the point. Because the clash hadn't ended with a handshake or a neat conclusion. It had ended in a way that felt truer to the subject itself, unresolved, painful, demanding attention. As the cameras faded to commercial, viewers at home were left with images of Samuel's fury, Joy's defiance, and a nation's seniors caught in the middle. Online, clips would soon explode across social media, hashtags forming, opinions dividing, each side claiming victory. But beneath the noise, the question lingered louder than any outburst. Are we really doing enough for the people who built this country and now depend on it most?